Bloody Mary, you have my child. When Jonie awoke, it was 9:58. She looked over at her digital clock. She jumped up from her bed and ran out of her room, stopping at the bathroom. She opened the door and carefully edged for the light switch. She expected a cold, clammy hand to wrap around hers, then pull her in. She found the switch and flipped it. The bathroom was in tip-top shape. Everything was in the order her mother had put it in. She took out a bobby pin that would aid in her plan. She reached for the doorknob and locked it from the outside. The alarm clock setting on the counter turned to 10 o'clock. She had to hurry. She took the bobby pin out of the lock. Jonie closed the door and headed for her room. But what seemed like 10 seconds after closing that door, she heard the cracking of glass and the small thump of footsteps on the linoleum. Once Jonie reached the door to her bedroom, she looked back. The doorknob was rattling back and forth. She felt fear wash over her like a bucket of ice-cold water. She had to get out of the house, but found it was too late. A long, bony finger with a sharp yellow nail protruded from the keyhole and twisted sideways with a small click. The finger recoiled and the door started to open slowly. Jonie ran into her room and slammed the door behind her. She put her back to it, eyes closed, praying soundlessly. Outside, she could hear the soft creaking of the carpet. It was corrupting. Jonie could hardly breathe. She knew it was coming. She knew. Then the footsteps ceased. The doorknob shook, but Jonie had the handle on it. There was a tenuous push on the door again, but Jonie still had her broad shoulder propped up against it. This time the door was hit with strong force that caused Jonie to step back a bit, but that made her push harder against the door. It came again, only stronger. This time the door even opened, introducing a wicked, rotting odor. Jonie pushed back, slamming the door. She started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. She needed something to prop up against it. She looked over to see her computer chair close to her flexing foot. She slid her foot under the bottom of it and dragged it closer. The door flung open again, but Jonie just pushed back, closing it again. She grabbed the chair with her free hand and pushed it under the doorknob. She made sure it was secure before jumping back onto her bed, but the chair held the door in place. She looked over at her digital clock. It was 10:04. Just one more minute. She looked at the carpet. Blood, streamers of it, were seeping under the crack. The chair was rocking back and forth and blood was dripping out from the keyhole. Then the digital clock turned to 10:05. Jonie looked back at the door, but there was no more movement. She could distinctly hear someone step into the bathroom. Then the door slammed, the lock clicking. She put her face into her hands. This was going to happen every night. But how could she keep doing this? She lay face down on her bed, struggling with a breath that threatened not to come. A week later, Jonie snuck out of her house and went to the park. It was 9:39, and soon she would be visited again. Jonie sat down in a swing, her head in her hands. 10:05. Mary checked her own watch, her arm shaking slightly. Nothing happened. Okay, I can go home now, Jonie said shakily. They both got up and started to their homes. In the pure darkness, Mary could see Jonie's pale white skin. It was milky, and it made Mary's skin tingle. It was like sharing the sidewalk with a ghost. Then Mary reached the street corner that would lead to her house, but Jonie grabbed her arm. Mary wished she hadn't because the grasp was icy and felt like rubber. She hadn't cut her nails for a while, and they were digging into Mary's skin. Walk me to my house? She asked. Mary and Jonie made their way to Jonie's house, which was on the opposite corner. Mary looked over at her. She was literally quaking with cold, mixed with fear. If Jonie was telling the truth, she was truly in hell. Then sirens broke the awkward silence, followed by a plume of smoke that covered the sky. Then there were yells of desperate and frantic men. Jonie and Mary exchanged worried looks before Jonie took off in a stumbling sprint. Jonie! Mary yelled, running after her, slippers flipping away from her feet. Rocks, bits of gravel, and what seemed like a rusty nail cut through her feet. Mary squinged in pain, but kept running until she was around the bend to see Jonie's house at the end of the corner, or what was left of Jonie's house. It was swallowed in flames, firemen trying their best to keep the inferno down. Jonie was running toward the house, yelling frantically, but two firemen grabbed her by each arm and held her down. Jonie fought back, tears flooding out of her open eyes. Mandy stepped into her freshly painted house, slipping off her backpack. I'm home, she called, but her mom was most likely working and her dad was probably out on an important meeting. She sat down on the couch, not bothering to do her homework. She was too preoccupied with all that was happening. Mandy turned on her TV and started to stare into it, getting lost. TV always helped her with things that troubled her. Also, Jonie helped with those kinds of things, but Jonie seemed like she needed a little help too. Mandy lunged for the phone, but then thought she wouldn't be at Mary's yet. She didn't even know where Mary lived. She huffed a sigh of disappointment. Mandy slouched into her chair, waiting for a phone call. Come on, Mary, don't keep me waiting like this, she thought to herself. Jonie was her best friend of all these years. She did not believe in ghosts or any kind of supernatural things, but there was something about the way Jonie was behaving the past few days. She had been through a lot. All of a sudden, a dark figure passed through the room, which made her screech out in horror. Jonie was lying on the floor in front of her, with a knife driven into her head. Then the phone rang, and Mandy bolted out of her sleep. It was nighttime, and a blanket was wrapped around her. Mandy snatched the phone and set it to her ear. "Hello?" she said sourly into the phone. "Mandy, turn your clock to 10, Jonie's voice said on the other side. "Why?" "So I can come to get you. All of you, especially Jonie. You'll all fall into temptation." It was a woman's voice now. Then blood splurted out of the phone, drenching her. She burst up from her couch, sleep still on her, when she hit the ground. She then snapped her eyes open. It was just a dream. She was on the floor, breathing hard. Just a dream. The clock on the wall said it was 5:42, so she had been sleeping for some time. Her parents still weren't home, but she wasn't worried about that. They usually came home around 6. Still, Mary hadn't even called, and Mandy was worried about that. Mandy went into the kitchen to find the butcher knife lying neatly on the kitchen counter. That hadn't been like that a few hours ago, or had it? Mandy walked quickly out of the kitchen and slowly went into the bathroom. She ran the water, cupping her hands, and she caught a pool of it to slosh on her face. Then she leaned over the sink. She looked up to see her crisp reflection in the wall-high mirror. She wiped her face and fixed her hair in front of it. She went to leave when something made her stop and look back into the mirror. She remembered Jonie's party, where Jonie had said the chant in front of the mirror. "No, no Bloody Mary," she said, smiling. Mandy frowned. She touched the mirror thoughtfully. She then closed the door and locked it. Mandy put her finger to the light switch for a second, still looking at her shuddering reflection. Then the bathroom went black. Mandy stared blindly into the darkness, trying to calm down. She let out a little frightened squeak before reciting the chant. When she was finished, she added, "Bloody Mary, I have your child." By then she was bolder and sure that she was safe. Darkness, silence. Nothing was happening. She let out a low, relieved sigh before reaching for the light switch. Crack, crack. Mandy's hand stopped in midair, her head pounding. The mirror was cracking. Mandy leapt for the door, but she couldn't go any farther than a slight shuffle. She started to panic. Then Mandy froze, eyes fixed on the darkened mirror. A blue woman, dressed in a long robe, stood behind a slightly illuminated Mandy. The woman was covered in pouring blood. Her eyes were white, and her mouth was twisted in a horrid frown. Mandy started to moan as a hand rose up and rested on her shoulder. Nails sunk down into her skin. Then she was thrust backward, and she was slashed across the spine with a long bladed cane. Mandy's body writhed back and forth as she was slashed and stabbed. Mandy was still screaming until the butt of the cane came down into her mouth, knocking out all her front teeth. The glowing woman frowned throughout the whole process, eyes never leaving Mandy. The blade of the scepter was thrust into Mandy's intestines, causing a streamer of blood to squirt across the bathroom wall. Mandy then was thrust forward, face first into the floor, smashing the top of her skull, and then Bloody Mary picked the semi-dead Mandy up by the collar and dropped her backward onto the bathroom counter. Her head smashed into the mirror, finishing her off. Her eyes rolled back and her head lolled to the side. Then Bloody Mary was simply gone, leaving a blood-stained bathroom and a bleeding corpse to go with it. All this happened in 30 seconds. Then the phone started to ring and ring until it got the voicemail. "Hi, Mandy, I guess I called at the wrong time. Jonie's okay, she's right here. We had a bit of a scare, but no big deal." "Okay, I'll call back. Bye," said Mary. Right at that very second, Mandy's parents walked in the house together. "Well, she didn't pick up," Mary said, turning towards Jonie, who was curled up in Mary's bed. They were both in Mary's room, both counting down to 10 o'clock. Mary was sitting at her desk right in front of a huge mirror. Jonie was looking at the mirror, watching her reflection, her withering, dying one. "Jonie, did you hurt yourself when you fainted?" Mary asked worriedly. "No," Jonie said. "My dad's really worried," Mary said. "Lose the mirror," Jonie replied. "What?" "I can't sleep in this room. It has a mirror." Mary looked back at it. She could see Jonie shuddering in the glass. She was convinced that Bloody Mary was tearing her world apart. "Well, when our guest room's ready, you can sleep down there," Mary replied, looking back over at Jonie. 4 more hours, Jonie said, ignoring Mary completely. Mary sat back, secretly wanting Bloody Mary to take her away from all this complication, yet Jonie too was wishing the same thing. Mary left to go to the bathroom, and when she got back to the room, she turned the knob savagely. Locked. Mary twisted the knob again. "Jonie, come on, let me in," Mary yelled. No response. Mary slammed against the door, yelling for Jonie to open. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs yelled up at Mary. "Yes, fine," Mary lied. Mary turned back to the door and bent down to look through the keyhole. Mary gasped. The room was in a mess. Jonie was against the opposite wall of the mirror, writhing around like she was being slapped. The mirror was pouring down blood, flooding a river of red over Mary's white carpet. Mary extracted a pin from her hair and stuck it into the lock. She turned and spun it around until she heard a click. She swung open the door and gasped again. Jonie was lying in the corner, shivering fiercely. The room was in perfect order, and the mirror was back to its clean self. The carpet was no longer bloodstained. Mary, she somehow got through the mirror. She would kill me if I sleep in here," Jonie stuttered. I just saw this room and you being torn apart. What do you mean? Mary said, running towards Jonie to help. She came out. She would have killed me. Her eyes, Jonie sobbed. Mary led Jonie out of the room, trying to ignore the freezing temperature. Mary and Jonie sat down in her sister Katie's room to talk, but Jonie just rolled over to her side. Mary got up and put a blanket around Jonie's shoulders. But her friend didn't close her eyes, not even to blink. Mary passed her room but closed the door, still thinking of the room she saw through the keyhole. She didn't even think she could sleep in it anymore. She didn't want to leave Jonie alone, so she went into the computer room right next to Katie's room. She turned on the computer to play some solitaire. She couldn't stop thinking of Mandy and the way she looked at Mary before she walked home. Mary had even promised to Mandy she would call her. Mary thought that maybe if she had called just a few minutes earlier, Mandy might still be alive. Mary leaned back in her chair. In the room alone, Jonie spoke to herself. It's the reflection in the mirror. It's the blood on the glass. Jonie's body twitched suddenly from Katie's bedroom floor, foam starting to drop from her chin. 9 o'clock, Jonie said, right as the clock in Katie's room turned to 9. That night, Mary fell asleep in the computer room, and Jonie was absent from Katie's bedroom floor. Come to think of it, Mary's father didn't even think twice as to why Jonie spent every night locked in the basement from 10 to waking hours. He was a little worried why he would find a new crack in the bathroom mirror each night. Mary herself was sleeping down on the couch instead of her room all that week. She kept thinking of what Jonie had said about Bloody Mary in her bedroom mirror. Mary's father was worried of that as well. Jonie, though, slept down in the basement, the door locked. Sleep was not the right word, though. She would just huddle in the corner, eyes wide and glassy. When she rarely did fall asleep, she would dream of Mandy being thrown into a shattering mirror by a blood-stained arm. Jonie would then wake up in a cold sweat, only to get up to get ready for another day, even if it was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then Mary would wake up to her alarm clock to find a pale Jonie, dressed in her regular clothes and backpack, staring down at her. Good morning, Mary, Jonie would say coolly every morning. Ready for the day to come? The next 2 weeks were horrible for Mary and Jonie. Night after night, as Mary slept on the couch, she could feel a cold draft pass by her huddled figure. She would always wrap her blanket over her head and try not to breathe hard. Mary would even hear footsteps pass right by the couch and down the hall. This would always happen at 10 o'clock. Mary would then listen intently as the basement door down the hall rattled and banged around. This is, of course, where Jonie slept each night. The door would just keep rattling silently at first, and then to a point where Mary thought her family would wake up. They never did, though. Some nights, Mary just wanted to jump up and run, but she had no idea of what the outcome would be. Right when Mary thought she was about to go mad, the rattling would stop and the cold breeze rushed by again. Sometimes Mary would hear the patter of blood on the carpet or the heavy wheezing of something. It was always 10:05. When Mary finally did wake up from her horrific nightmares, she would find no blood on the carpet, but there would always be a pale Jonie waiting for her. The girls weren't doing so well either. They were all mourning the death of Mandy. They couldn't understand how Jonie showed no emotion or compassion for Mandy. Jonie would just sit silently in class, staring at the blackboard and whispering under her breath. The girls were also worried for Mary because, just like Jonie, she wasn't getting too much sleep and was becoming incredibly silent. Mary was also falling asleep a lot during class, which always led her straight to the principal's office. Her father was disappointed and worried. Mary was usually such a good girl, but she had been going through a lot, yet he really didn't have any idea